The morning Sloane found out her boyfriend was sleeping with her landlord, she was already 3 hours into a double shift and wearing shoes with a hole in the left sole. She'd worked the overnight at Prentice and Cole Accounting, the kind of firm where the coffee machine broke twice a week, and the partners still called her the temp after 14 months. She'd been covering for Dana, who had a sick kid, because Sloane was the type of person people asked favors of, not the type people worried about. She found out about Garrett and Mrs. Fenwick the way she found out most things. By accident at the worst possible moment, holding a stack of quarterly reports she'd just finished reconciling at 4 in the morning, her phone lit up. A text from a number she didn't recognize. Thought you should know. Your boyfriend and your landlord have been together since March. Check the parking garage on Clement. Silver Audi, his car, her building. She stared at the message for a long time, long enough for the coffee machine to wheeze through another cycle in the break room down the hall. March. It was now October. 7 months. She'd been paying rent to the woman sleeping with her boyfriend for 7 months. She'd smiled at Mrs. Fenwick in the elevator. She'd apologized once for being 2 days late because her check got held up between banks, and Mrs. Fenwick had said, "Not to worry, dear," and Sloane had felt grateful. She finished the quarterly reports. She sent them to the partner in charge. She clocked out, took the bus home, and stood in front of her building for 11 minutes before going inside. Garrett's things were still everywhere. His coffee mug, his charger coiled on the nightstand. A gym bag she'd tripped over so many times she'd started routing around it like it was furniture. She packed everything into 2 garbage bags, set them outside his half of the closet, and sat on the edge of the bed until the ceiling stopped, feeling like it was pressing down. She didn't cry. She'd done the math on this one before it even started. Garrett was the type of man who kept his options open and called it being easygoing. She'd just assumed being easygoing was something he did in public. She was wrong. She was wrong a lot, apparently, about a lot of things. She had enough saved for 2 more months of rent. After that, depending on whether she got the permanent position at Prentice and Cole, which the partners had been discussing since August, with the enthusiasm of people who were not actually discussing it, she would need to find somewhere else. Mrs. Fenwick would not be renewing her lease. Sloane already knew that. Mrs. Fenwick had a way of letting problem tenants know without actually saying anything. Sloane was now a problem tenant, for reasons that had nothing to do with her. She ate a piece of toast standing over the sink, and then she went to sleep, fully dressed, on top of the covers, because some days that was what you did. She gave Garrett his bags the following Thursday without a word. He started to say something. She went back inside and locked the door. She did not fall apart. She did not call anyone. She had 3 close friends from college who had since scattered to Atlanta, Portland, and somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, where they were all apparently thriving, and she did not want to call them at midnight to talk about a man who wasn't worth the long-distance minutes. She went back to work. She reconciled more accounts. She got very quiet and very efficient in the way that people get when there is nothing left to be efficient about except work. The permanent position was given to a man named Brett, who had been there 4 months and wore cufflinks, unironically. The managing partner delivered the news to Sloane personally, which she supposed was meant to be a kindness. He said she was an invaluable asset to the team. He said the decision was not a reflection of her capabilities. He said he hoped she would continue to contribute in her current capacity. She thanked him. She went to the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, and then she went back to her desk and finished her shift. On the way home, she stopped at a bar she'd never been to before. It was not her neighborhood. She'd taken the wrong bus by mistake, which she realized 6 stops too late, and it was raining, and she was tired, and there was a bar with a light on. She went in. The place was called Harrow's. It had the energy of a bar that had been there before the neighborhood was fashionable, and had decided not to change when it became fashionable and was now on the other side of fashionable, where things either become landmarks or get torn down. The bar top was dark wood, scarred and thick. The bottles were arranged without any apparent system. A jazz record was playing from somewhere she couldn't identify. She sat at the far end of the bar, away from the two men nursing whiskey near the door, and ordered whatever the rail bourbon was. She was not a drinker, technically. She had 2 drinks twice a year, at Christmas and at the one work party she allowed herself to attend annually. But it was October. She had just been passed over for a promotion she'd been doing the job for, without the title for 8 months, and her landlord was sleeping with her ex-boyfriend, so she felt the occasion warranted some flexibility in her own personal policy. The bourbon was rough. She appreciated that. She didn't want something smooth tonight. She was on her second when she became aware that the 2 men near the door were no longer talking. The bar had gotten quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of a slow night, but the quiet of people who have decided not to look at something. A man came in. She didn't turn to look. She watched him in the dark mirror behind the bottles, the warped one that made everyone look slightly unreal. Tall, dark coat, the kind of unhurried walk that comes from having very little left to be afraid of. He had a scar across his jaw that the dim light caught and then lost. He sat 2 stools away from her, not beside her, not at the far end. 2 stools which was close enough to be deliberate. The bartender appeared immediately. Not the sort of immediately that happens with regular customers. "The other kind, Mr. Vane," the bartender said. The man didn't answer. He looked at what Sloane was drinking and said, "One of those, and whatever she's having next." Sloane turned to look at him directly, because she'd had enough of pretending not to notice things this week. "I don't need someone to buy my drinks," she said. He looked at her. He had very pale eyes, grey or green, hard to tell in the light, and the expression of a man who was used to people saying things they thought were brave, and then revising their position. "It's not charity," he said. "You look like you're doing math." "I'm an accountant," she said. "I'm always doing math." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Something more internal than that. "What does the math say tonight?" he asked. She considered not answering. Then she thought about Brett and his cufflinks, and the managing partner, and his careful words. And she thought about Garrett's gym bag by the closet door. And she thought about 7 months of paying rent to a woman who was sleeping with her boyfriend. And she said, "It says I'm somewhere around net zero. Revenue matches expenditure. Nothing gained, nothing lost, just overhead." The man looked at her for a long moment. "Vane," he said, and it took her a second to realize he was introducing himself. "Sloane," she said. He nodded. He turned back to his drink. She turned back to hers. They sat like that for 20 minutes, which was actually a comfortable amount of time to sit next to a stranger without speaking, if you were both the kind of people who didn't feel obligated to fill silence. Then a man came through the back entrance. He was younger than Vane, with the look of someone who had recently run several blocks. He leaned down and said something in Vane's ear, very quietly. The music on the record player crackled. The 2 men near the door put money on the table and left without finishing their drinks. Vane turned to her. His expression hadn't changed, but something in the room had. "Do you have somewhere to be tonight?" he asked. She thought about her apartment, Garrett's absence, the ceiling. "Not particularly," she said. "Then I'd suggest not leaving through the front door for the next 10 minutes. She looked at him. She looked at the door. She thought about the math, which was not the math she usually did. This was a different kind of ledger. "What's through the back?" she said. "A car," he said, "and a better offer than whatever tonight was handing you." The better offer was, it turned out, a problem. The car was black and long, and the driver didn't look at her. The seats were the kind of leather that had never encountered anything as undignified as a grocery bag. Vane sat beside her with his hands loose in his lap and told her 3 things, in the flat manner of someone reciting facts that have been facts for a long time. First, someone had followed him into Harrow's tonight, with the intention of doing business he had not agreed to conduct. Second, the presence of a woman at his side had sufficiently complicated their calculation that they'd chosen to wait for a cleaner opportunity. Third, she was, as a result, now in his car, which created an obligation on his part that he preferred to discharge cleanly. "You used me as a deterrent," she said. I sat 2 stools away from a woman who was minding her own business, he said. The inference was theirs. That's a very careful way of saying yes. He looked at her with something that might have been the first stages of respect. I'll have you taken wherever you'd like, he said. Or if you'd prefer, you can come inside and I'll have someone explain the nature of the situation so you're not walking into anything blindly. She thought about what was at her apartment. She thought about the 2 garbage bags and the empty nightstand and the rent she owed to a woman she would never be able to look at normally again. Inside where? She said. It was a building in a part of the city she didn't have occasion to visit. The kind of neighborhood that existed in 2 versions simultaneously. The version in the civic record and the version everyone who lived nearby actually understood. The lobby had marble floors and a security desk and a man behind it who stood up very straight when Vane walked in. She was given a room that was larger than her apartment and had a window that looked out over the city like the city was a thing to be surveyed rather than merely endured. She sat on the edge of the bed and told herself she would leave in the morning. She'd had a strange night, that was all. She'd been in a bar and a man had sat nearby and the situation had been unusual. And she'd made a choice that was perhaps not the most carefully considered choice she'd ever made. But she'd made it with her eyes open, which was more than she could say for several of the choices she'd made in the last 7 months. She fell asleep with her shoes on. In the morning there was coffee outside her door and a note. The note said, "Breakfast is on the 4th floor. You're not a prisoner. You're also not obligated to leave before you're ready." It was signed with a V and nothing else. She went to the 4th floor because she was hungry and because she had at this point very little to lose by having breakfast somewhere unusual. The 4th floor was not a cafeteria. It was a dining room with a table long enough for a board meeting and a woman at the far end of it with a tablet and an espresso. The woman looked up when Sloane came in, assessed her with the efficiency of someone who assessed people professionally, and said, "Coffee's fresh. The eggs are better than they look." Her name was Renata, which Sloane found out 2 minutes later. She ran the operational finances for Vane's organization, which Sloane found out 4 minutes later, in the same dry tone someone might use to explain what they did at any other company. "What organization?" Sloane said. Renata looked at her over the rim of her espresso cup. "The kind," she said, "where the accounting is very complicated and very important, and we've had a vacancy for 6 weeks because the last person we hired didn't have the stomach for complexity." Sloane thought about Brett and his cufflinks. "What kind of complexity?" she said. 34 subsidiary entities across 9 cities, Renata said. Shell structures, asset transfers. Revenue that can't simply appear in a ledger without context. It requires someone who can hold a great deal of information simultaneously and not flinch. "I flinch at very little," Sloane said. Renata said, "I know," Vane mentioned. Sloane put down her coffee cup. "He watched me for 20 minutes and deduced I don't flinch?" "He said you were doing math in a bar at 11 at night after what appeared to be a very bad week, and you looked annoyed rather than afraid." Renata shrugged. For him, that's a reference. She met with Vane that afternoon. He was in an office that was not what she expected. She had expected, she wasn't sure. Something cinematic. Instead, it was a room with too many files and a window that faced a wall and a desk covered in actual paper, which was rarer than people assumed in her experience. He was on the phone when she came in. He gestured at the chair across from his desk without looking up. She sat. He finished the call. He looked at her. "You stayed," he said. "You said I wasn't a prisoner. People who aren't prisoners still leave." "I wanted to understand the offer first," she said. "I don't make decisions without understanding the offer. It's a personal policy." He leaned back in his chair. In the daylight, he looked less like the man in the bar mirror. More solid, more tired around the eyes. There was the scar on his jaw, and 2 more she could see on his left hand, which rested on the arm of the chair with the patience of a man who had learned patience the hard way. "The offer," he said, "is a position managing the financial architecture of several interconnected entities. The pay is 3 times what a firm like Prentice & Cole would offer a permanent employee. The work is meticulous and requires discretion. The hours are irregular. The situation occasionally involves complexity that most accountants would find disqualifying. The situation, she said, involves money that came from things that are not entirely legal. Some of it, he said, not all. The ratio changes. And what's the ratio currently? He looked at her. About 60-40. She thought about it. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, as a column of numbers, a balance, a structure that held or didn't hold. I'd need full access to the records, she said. If I'm going to structure this correctly, I need to see everything, not a curated version. That's not something I offer easily. It's not something I'm asking easily, she said. I'm telling you what I need to do the job. If that's not acceptable, I understand, and I'll find my own way out. He looked at her for a long time. Not the way Garrett used to look at her, which was the look of a man trying to figure out how much trouble something was going to be. This was different. This was the look of a man actually looking. Full access, he said, in exchange for absolute discretion. You tell no one. You document nothing outside of the internal system. You flag irregularities to me directly, not to anyone else. Agreed, she said. You should know, he said, that the people who have worked in this position before understood the parameters clearly. The ones who had difficulty were the ones who decided, after the fact, that they didn't. I'm not going to have difficulty, she said. I've spent 14 months being underestimated by people with worse instincts than mine. I know what I'm capable of. I just need someone to let me do it. There was a silence that felt like something settling into place. Monday, he said, Renata will show you the system. She stood. She picked up her bag. She was at the door when he said, without looking up from the desk, the week was as bad as it looked. She thought about the message she hadn't asked to receive, and the man who hadn't been worth receiving it about, and 14 months of being called the temp while doing the job permanently. Standard overhead, she said, nothing that wasn't already written off. She left. She went home and dealt with the practical matters. She gave Mrs. Fenwick notice in writing, 2 weeks, because she was not going to be the kind of person who let a bad situation make her into someone she didn't recognize. She found a sublet in a neighborhood she'd never considered and paid the deposit in cash, which she had never done before and which felt, despite everything, like forward motion. She called her friend in Atlanta and said she'd gotten a new job and it was complicated, and she'd explain later, and her friend said, good complicated or bad complicated. And Sloane said, still calculating, and her friend said, that's very you, and they hung up, and Sloane stood in her almost empty apartment for a few minutes, looking at the wall where Garrett's print had been. She'd bought that print. He'd always said he liked it. She'd given it to him when he left because it seemed efficient, and then she'd stood in front of the blank space on the wall and thought, that was mine. She took the print with her to the new apartment. She hung it herself. Monday, Renata gave her the codes. The system was, as advertised, complicated. It was also elegant in its way, the way all complex structures have an elegance if you look long enough, a logic underneath the apparent chaos, a pattern that rewarded patience and punished shortcuts. She understood it within the first 2 hours in the way she understood most financial systems, which was to say not completely, but enough to know where the load was bearing and where the cracks were. There were cracks. She flagged 3 in the first week. Vane came to her desk, not the other way around, and stood over her shoulder, looking at the screen while she walked him through what she'd found. He didn't say much. He had a way of listening that was very still, the way still water is still, not because nothing is happening underneath, but because there is too much happening for it to show. These 2, he said, pointing at the second and third items, are known being managed. The first one isn't. The first one is going to be a problem in about 90 days if no one addresses it, she said. Then address it, he said. I need authorization to restructure the Aldano holdings, she said, and I need the actual contracts from the Crane Street transfers, not the summaries. He looked at her. She held the look without thinking about it, which she understood later was one of the things people tended to fail at in this room. You'll have them today, he said. He left. He came back 20 minutes later with a drive. She worked until 11 that night. She went home. She came back at 7. It went on like this. The work was the best work she had ever done. She was not supposed to admit that, probably. It was not the kind of work that was supposed to feel good to be good at. But the truth was that the complexity was real, not manufactured, not inflated to impress, but actual structural complexity that required the full use of every skill she had, and some she hadn't known she had yet. And the work being difficult in a real way was the first time in years she'd felt like the job was actually the right size. She found more cracks. She fixed them. She restructured 4 subsidiary accounts and caught a discrepancy in the Harwick portfolio that turned out to be intentional, someone skimming, small amounts, clever intervals, and brought it to Vane with documentation and a recommendation. He read the documentation. He was quiet for a long time. "How long?" he said. 14 months, she said, nearly to the day. He looked at her then with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not anger, not even surprise. Something more like a man who has been given back something he'd written off. "I didn't know," he said. Flat, not an excuse, just a fact. "No," she said. "You wouldn't have, with the way the accounts were structured. Whoever set this up knew your oversight patterns well enough to build around them." He sat back. He looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at her. "Who else have you told?" "No one. That's what we agreed." He nodded, very slowly. "You had documentation of fraud in my organization," he said. "Against me. You could have leveraged that." "I could have," she said. "I wasn't hired to leverage things. I was hired to manage accounts. That's what I'm doing." He was quiet again, the kind of quiet that had mass to it. "You're not what I expected," he said. "People keep underestimating me," she said. "I've stopped being surprised by it. I've also stopped explaining myself in advance." Something shifted in him then, not the careful professional distance he maintained in this office. Something underneath it, something older. "The person who did this," he said carefully, "will need to be dealt with." "That part," she said, "is not my department." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." She gathered her files. She was at the door when he said her name. "Just Sloane," she turned. "You could have left at any point," he said. "After the first week, after you understood what this was." She thought about that. "I needed a job," she said. "You could have gotten another job." She looked at him. "Not one where I was actually doing the job." She left. She did not look back to see if he was watching, because she had gotten good, recently, at not checking to see if she was being seen, 6 weeks in. She found herself working late because she wanted to, not because she had to, which was new. She found herself eating lunch in the 4th-floor dining room because the coffee was better than anything in the building she used to work in, and because sometimes Renata was there, and Renata was the kind of person who said exactly what she thought, which Sloane had not had enough of recently. She also found herself, occasionally, in proximity to Vane. Not on purpose. The building was large and the people in it moved through it according to their own patterns, and his patterns sometimes intersected with hers. He came by her office. She had an office now, with a lock and a window that didn't face a wall, in the evenings. Never with anything urgent. He would look at what she was working on. Sometimes he asked a question. Sometimes he didn't say anything. She understood, gradually, that this was Vane's version of checking in. That he did not do the ordinary social things. The small talk, the maintained distance, the performance of not looking, that most people used to indicate they were paying attention. He paid attention in ways that were more direct, and therefore, paradoxically, harder to pretend not to notice. He noticed when she was tired. He noticed when she'd found something that bothered her in the accounts, and hadn't resolved it yet. He noticed, once, that she'd come in with the same coffee from the same place, 3 mornings in a row, which was either 3 mornings of creature comfort, or 3 mornings of routine as coping mechanism, and he didn't ask. But he had better coffee delivered to her office that afternoon, without explanation. She didn't thank him. He didn't require thanks. It was simply noted, acted on, done. She thought about that more than was probably useful. The problem arrived on a Tuesday. It arrived in the form of a man named Corbin, who came through the front lobby with the easy confidence of someone who had been here before and expected to be welcomed. and who was met instead by two of Vane's people, who asked him to wait. Sloane learned about Corbin at 4 in the afternoon when Renata knocked on her door and said, "There's a situation. Vane wants you." She went. The room she was taken to was not Vane's office. It was a different room, lower in the building, with a table and 6 chairs and a quality of light that suggested it was used for conversations that needed to be contained. Vane was at the head of the table. 2 men she recognized from the building's operations were to his left. The man, Corbin, was at the far end with the studied calm of a man who was frightened but had decided not to show it. Vane looked at her when she came in. "Sloane manages our financial architecture," he said, to the room, to Corbin specifically. Corbin looked at her. He revised something behind his eyes. "This is a private matter," he said. To Vane, "Everything here is private," Vane said. "That's the point." The matter was this. Corbin had, for the last 14 months, the same 14 months she'd identified, she realized, which meant Corbin was the same, been redirecting funds through a vehicle he controlled, small enough not to be noticed at any single moment, large enough to become meaningful over time. Corbin, it turned out, had also been talking to people who did not want what was good for Vane's organization. He had been providing information. He had been providing access to certain financial records, which was how those people had known how to find Vane in a bar on a Tuesday night and make an inconvenient choice about timing. The man from the bar, the 2 men near the door who had left without finishing their drinks. Sloane sat with that. Vane looked at her across the table. "You have questions. 1, she said. "Does this affect the Meridian account?" Vane's expression didn't change, but one of the men to his left shifted. "Why?" Vane said. "Because if Corbin had access to the financial records, he had access to the Meridian structure, and the Meridian structure is what I built the entire Q4 consolidation around. If it's compromised, I need to rebuild it from a clean base before the end of the month." Silence. Then Vane said, "It's compromised. Then I need 3 days and full system isolation," she said. "No external access to anything while I rebuild. You'll have it." She stood. She looked at Corbin, who was watching her with the expression of a man recalculating. "You should have been better at hiding it," she said to him, not unkindly. "The intervals were too regular. Real expenses aren't regular. Real expenses are messy." She left. She heard later that Corbin left the city. She didn't ask how. Some things she had understood by then were not her department. 3 days. She rebuilt the Meridian structure from a clean base, working with the system isolated, the access logs running. Nothing going out that she didn't personally authorize. She slept 4 hours the first night and 6 the second. By the 3rd day, the structure was better than it had been before. Tighter, more defensible, designed from the beginning to account for the kind of leak that had brought it down. Vane came in on the 3rd day at midnight and stood behind her, looking at the screen. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. "It's better now. Harder to skim, harder to access from outside, harder to read if you don't know the full architecture, and you're the only one who knows the full architecture. Now, yes." He was quiet for a moment. "That makes you very important," he said. "I know," she said. "I was important at Prentice and Cole too. They just didn't notice." He pulled the other chair over, not behind her, beside her, and sat down. It was the first time he'd sat, physically, at the same level as her in the same room. He looked at the screen. She didn't move away. They both understood, without saying, that something about the week had changed the coordinates. "Corbin was here a long time," he said. "I trusted the wrong indicators." "Everyone trusts the wrong indicators sometimes," she said. "The system was designed to be trustworthy. That's not a flaw in you. It's a flaw in the system, and now the system is fixed." He looked at the screen for a long moment. "I've been in this business 20 years, he said. "People tell me what I want to hear. It's structural. The power dynamics make honesty expensive. No one tells me when I'm wrong unless I'm catastrophically wrong, and usually it's too late to matter." "I'll tell you when you're wrong," she said. "That's part of managing the accounts." He turned to look at her. She looked back. "You're not afraid of me," he said. "I've been afraid of the wrong things for a long time," she said. "I'm trying a different approach." He was quiet. Then, very carefully, he said, What are the right things to be afraid of? Staying still, she said, taking up less space than you're capable of, spending years being an asset to people who won't call you by name. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him in 6 weeks. Not Vane the employer, Vane the calculation. Something else. Someone else who had been there longer than the rest of it. Your name? He said. Is Sloane. Yes, she said. I know it, he said. I've known it since the bar. I know, she said. I noticed. They sat for a moment more. For what it's worth, I stopped planning to leave somewhere around week 3. He nodded. He didn't look away. The offer, he said, as it currently stands. Permanent position. Full access. Whatever salary you think is appropriate, within reason. I think my assessment of appropriate and your assessment of reasonable will probably align, she said. And outside the offer, he said carefully, like a man reading a contract he didn't want to misrepresent, there's a secondary item I don't have language for yet, but I'm aware of it. She looked at him. She thought about the coffee that had appeared without explanation, and the way he came to her door in the evenings, and the bar mirror, and the 2 stools of deliberate distance that had turned into something else. I'm aware of it too, she said. I'm an accountant. I track everything. He almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen him get. She turned back to the screen. He stayed where he was. Outside, the city pressed its lights against the window, all that illuminated ordinary life laid out like a ledger she'd already stopped trying to balance, because she'd found, finally, a set of books worth keeping.